Hi everyone, welcome to our first PowerPoint slideshow lecture for Autism Spectrum Disorder, our class here together this semester. This is how I'll be presenting all of our lectures and the materials that I've prepared for you this semester. So I've created a PowerPoint slideshow and I'm now recording it, and I'll present it to you as a YouTube video that you can watch for yourself. If you're interested in printing the slides from the slideshow, you'll need to download the actual PowerPoint file, which I've also attached on Blackboard for you to use. One reason you might want to do that is because you can print those the slides and take notes on them, and that is an option for you to include as a tool in your toolbox. If you choose to do so, you just need to make sure that the notes you include are pretty thorough and complete. You want to really demonstrate both your understanding of the material that's been presented in the lecture, as well as show how you would be able to refer back to these notes and that they are complete, not kind of just a little bit of piecemeal or a few fill-in-the-blank kind of ideas here and there. In our slideshow here today, we're going to be talking about a few different basic topics related to autism spectrum disorder, just to get you familiar with the disorder itself. We're going to start out by talking about what autism is and a little bit about how it's diagnosed. We're going to talk about the history of the diagnosis of autism. It's changed quite a bit in the past 60 years. We're going to talk about some of the causes of ASD, or at least some of the theories around the causes. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that an individual who has been diagnosed with autism may be supported, what types of interventions or therapies might be used. A lot of these topics you'll find we're going to cover in more detail later on this semester. So, what is autism? Autism spectrum disorder, commonly abbreviated ASD, is a neurological disorder that begins in early childhood and persists throughout adulthood. It's sometimes diagnosed as early as infancy. However, sometimes the symptoms may not actually be evident until later in life, so some people may go quite a long time before their diagnosis is given. Often that is related to the severity of their symptoms and the severity of the disorder. One important thing to note is that ASD is a lifelong disorder. Different people talk about the effects that interventions and therapies may have on individuals with ASD, and although some people quite strongly like to talk about a cure for ASD, I prefer to talk about it as something that's changed, right? So ASD, it's related to what's happening neurologically for someone. It's about what's happening in the brain, and because the brain is functioning differently, the brain cannot be completely cured of this different way of functioning, but it can be changed quite dramatically because our brain is always changing and being reformed through different experiences that we're having. So a lot of people out there would probably say that it is misleading to say that autism has been cured, but certainly the severity of autism can be changed to a great degree. In order for autism or ASD to be diagnosed, deficits must be seen in two different areas, and they must both be seen in both of these areas. So an individual must have a significant deficit in social communication and social interaction, and a significant deficit in having restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, right? So if you someone who only had a social communication or a social interaction deficit, they don't have ASD. They might have another type of neurological disorder, but they don't have ASD. And the same thing with the repetitive patterns. In addition to having deficits in both of these areas, the symptoms that are presented must cause significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So there are lots of people, probably that you know and I know, who have poor social communication skills and who have restricted patterns of behavior. However, if the symptoms that they demonstrate are not significant enough to impair their functioning in normal life, if they're able to get by, if they're able to make a couple of friends and hold down a job, they don't have ASD. They might have something else going on, they might not. But that's important to remember when we're talking about diagnosing ASD. We're going to talk briefly about the history of autism in the DSM. So the DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorder. It's the standard by which ASD is diagnosed and the standard by which all psychiatric disorders are diagnosed. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association, the APA. I want to cover the history of it really quickly, and then I want to start talking about what's happening today with the DSM, because it's a pretty significant change in the world of autism. The original DSM-1 was released in 1952, and autism had been recognized as a unique condition around 1943, but it was not included in the DSM-1 as a separate diagnosis. The same thing happened in 1968 when the second release of the DSM was put out. Autism was not included as a separate diagnostic category. So children or individuals who exhibited what today we would call autistic-like behaviors, at that time they would have been diagnosed as schizophrenic. There was no professional differentiation between schizophrenia and autism, and although that might seem a little bit shocking to us today, we need to remember that the middle of the 20th century was when this idea of psychiatric disorders and mental disorders was just becoming understood and just becoming researched and just becoming studied. So it makes sense that there was work to be done at this point in time. The DSM-3 was released in 1980. This is the first time when autism is identified as a separate diagnostic category, so at this point people could be diagnosed with autism. However, at the beginning there was only one autism designation. It was called infantile autism, so that meant that a child could only be identified as an infant, and then there were only 6 characteristics that were listed, and each of those symptoms had to be present in order for an individual to be diagnosed. They did drop the descriptor infantile in 1987 because there was a lot of kind of controversy as to whether or not that was appropriate. The DSM-4 was published in 1994, so that was about 20 years ago. And the DSM-4 is actually the diagnostic criteria that has most shaped how we think of autism today, because not only did it include autistic disorder, or classic autism it was sometimes called, a diagnosis could now be made under 4 other subcategories of autism. Okay, so a person could be diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, Rett's disorder, which I'm sure most of you are not familiar with, as well as childhood disintegrative disorder and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So those 2 in the middle there, Rett's disorder and childhood disintegrative disorder, were a pretty small percentage of all autism diagnoses. They were pretty severe as far as the effects on the individual. However, Asperger's disorder, as we know, a good number of people were diagnosed with this disorder. And then pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified was always kind of a catch-all sort of diagnosis where nobody, if somebody was presenting symptoms but they didn't fit in any of the categories, that's what they would be diagnosed with. Compared to the DSM-3, in the DSM-4, major changes were made to the criteria that needed to be met for a diagnosis of autism. Now, instead of 6, there were 16 different symptoms that could be used to describe ASD, but an individual only needed to exhibit 6 of those 16. So you can see there's a pretty big change there. The DSM-5. So you may or may not be aware of the fact that in May 2013, the DSM-5 was released. The DSM-5 has significantly changed the diagnosis of autism for a few different reasons. We're back to only having one umbrella term. Officially, there is now only autism spectrum disorder. There are no longer any subtypes, including Asperger's syndrome. So if you were to go today to be diagnosed by a clinician, the only diagnosis that they could offer you is autism spectrum disorder, officially. The diagnostic criteria was modified as well. And we're going to look at some other materials this week. I'm going to give you a few things to read that will give you more details about the diagnostic criteria. I don't need to just sit here and read to you a whole long list of how it's diagnosed. I'll let you take a look at that yourself. There has been a lot of mixed reactions to these changes. I'm sure you can think of a few good reasons why. Eliminating a diagnosis that a lot of people have been walking around with for a good many of years is going to stir up a lot of reactions and a lot of pretty strong emotions from many different people. However, something that's interesting to note is that really the changes that have kind of officially been put out, it's going to take a while for them to become widespread. It's not really clear yet how the revised criteria in the DSM-5 is going to change the face of autism. It's changing it even now, but it's not really clear how that's happening. So that's something we're going to talk about on the discussion board this week, and I do have a couple of other readings for you to look at as well. So all of that together should give you an idea of kind of the history of the diagnosing of autism. And I hope it helps you to understand that while autism itself maybe hasn't changed in the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how you want to look at it, our perception of autism is changing. We as humans are always trying to understand ourselves, what's happening with ourselves. We're trying to understand science and the causes behind things that we're witnessing. And we're looking for ways to describe it. The DSM is one way to do so. It's the official way to do so, so we're very interested in what it has to say. But as you can see, it's imperfect. It doesn't get it right all the time either, and so things are always being modified in different ways. I want to give a little bit more of a description of Asperger's syndrome to you, just for your own clarity as we go forward in the class. A lot of times there's kind of these two ends of the spectrum that we think about. So remember, the name of the disorder is autism spectrum disorder, and that's because most individuals who are diagnosed exist on this very wide range, this very wide spectrum of abilities and symptoms and the different presentations of their challenges that they present. So a lot of times we might think of people with classic autism on one end of the spectrum. They're very low functioning. They have a lot of challenges that make it difficult for them to maintain what we would consider a typical life. And then there are those with Asperger's syndrome that we often think of on the other end of the spectrum, who are in many ways very high functioning. So young children with Asperger's syndrome do have difficulty with communication and social interaction and other behaviors, but they are often much more capable with language than children with autism. So a lot of times because of that, they may not be diagnosed as early. They may not be diagnosed until they head to grade school, to elementary school, because then their deficits begin to show up a little bit more. And their deficits in language are often a little bit more subtle. They learn how to talk, they know how to communicate, but they don't understand nonverbal communication, for instance. By middle school, children with Asperger's do often learn to socialize, communicate, understand socially acceptable behaviors, but they're often, they need to be taught these things explicitly, right? We assume that most children are just going to kind of pick up how to interact with peers and adults. Children with Asperger's often need to be taught those things. Children with Asperger's typically have normal to above average intelligence, so and it might be especially in the areas of logical and reasoning skills. Many children with Asperger's syndrome have intense obsessions, many of which often are related to mechanical objects or mechanical things. We often see children with Asperger's who are really interested in things like trains or elevators, and that might have something to do with the logical way that those things work as well. And children with Asperger's, you see here, they do develop normally in the areas of self-help and adaptive behaviors. That's why they are able to, live on their own and function pretty typically in regular society, but they do have those delays in social skills. Causes of ASD. I'm just going to cover this really briefly because we're going to talk a lot more about it next week. So some of the research that's been done has shown that many major brain structures are affected in autism, both in formation and functioning. So remember, ASD is a neurological disorder. The formation of the brain, the way it looks, the size of different parts of the brain is affected, and the functioning, where different brain functioning is happening in the brain, where things are being processed in the brain. These are different for people who have ASD. So it is a physical abnormality or a physical difference in the brain. Some people believe neurotransmitters play a role. Some evidence points to genetic factors. There may be something related to the age of parents. And some people are really interested in whether vaccines have a role, but others disagree with that. And lastly, the strategies and interventions. I'm just going to let you take a look at this list. We're going to talk a lot about all of these different interventions as we go through the course. We're going to spend quite a few weeks talking about them. It's important for you to know that no one of these strategies or interventions is the key to helping someone with autism. It depends on the individual, it depends on their symptoms, it depends on their needs. And so I look forward to covering all of this and more with you this semester.